Noswaith dda, croeso, good evening, welcome. Welcome to our talk for this evening. I am delighted that Marian Gwyn is speaking with us today on the topic of diversifying museums in Wales, rethinking collections and communities. My name is Paminda Dillon, and I am the project leader for the Welsh Asian Heritage Project at the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. The Welsh Asian Heritage Project is a community engagement project funded by the Anti-Racist Wales programme with two aims: to record, archive, and celebrate the stories of Welsh Asian communities, particularly of Ugandan Asians, including those who were expelled from Uganda in 1972 and some who were accommodated at the camp in Tonfanau, North Wales. We are also recording important places of cultural, religious, and historical significance to the Asian communities, and including stories of people who have inspired these. So this is a topic very much close to our heart. I wish I could say a very warm welcome in terms of the summer, but a very warm welcome from the heart to this evening's talk. This is our 5th monthly seminar. The seminars provide a platform for wider debate around equality, migration, resilience, identity, culture, and heritage. So I hope everyone present today will take an active part. Before we start, just a couple of organizational things. Please do write your questions for Marian after her talk in the Q&A function and not in the chat. We will be using the chat to post additional information for you. Tell us your name, and if you would like to be on camera, please indicate by raising the virtual hand, and we will try and make that possible. This evening's talk is being recorded, and it will be available on the YouTube and on our other platforms. So now to the talk, Diversifying Museums in Wales, Rethinking Collections and Communities by Marian Gwyn. Dr. Marian Gwyn is a heritage consultant with many years' experience in working with cross-cultural heritage sites across the UK, and currently leads on this innovative programme funded by the Welsh Government to support local museums in Wales, not just to develop robust and long-lasting change, but to ensure that museums across the nation remain relevant and inclusive in the 21st century. Just to add that Marian has also recently worked with the Commission colleagues on the People's Collection, Wales Charter, for decolonising the collection and the decolonising toolkit. I and several other colleagues have attended several workshops led by Dr. Marian Gwyn, and I can honestly say that I have learned something new every time. So I'm looking forward to learning more this evening. Dr. Marian Gwyn, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Paminda. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I've attended as many of these seminars as I possibly can, and it is a joy to be here today. So I'm sure you will all yell at me if you can't see my screen.
We can.
Excellent, thank you very much. Right, okay, diversifying museums in Wales. What's this all about? It's basically about a project called Museums, Collections and Cynefin. And this is very much a part of the same body of funding that Paminda has just been talking about. And I'll come to that in a moment. But I think before actually going over the project that we're running, I just want to go over briefly the foundation on what it's based on, because I think once you know why we're doing it, it puts into perspective what we're actually doing. Now, I'm sure we all love our local museums, even if we may not really question their presence. It's as if they've always been there as an integral part of our townscapes. And I think if asked, most people would say, if they asked, what's the purpose of your local museum, it may be that most people would say, oh, it's there to share the history of the local area. And if pushed, then they may add a little bit more and say that in a way, it represents the identity of that area. And we know, of course, that museums come in all shapes and all different sizes. This is the Pitt Rivers Museum, an amazing museum. And of course, we have our big nationals, we have our locals, and we also have our specialist museums as well, anthropological, ethnographic, railway, heritage, all sorts of different museums. What they tend to have in common is a collections policy that governs what they accept and what they won't accept, and what they have within their collections that represents the theme or whatever it is that they want to say. And so there are choices of regarding what a museum has in its collections. Now, museums in Wales began very differently to those in England. Museums in England tended, I mean, they started really from the beginning of the end of the 17th century. I think the British Museum takes its origins back to the 1690s, and of course well into the 18th century. And they typically reflected colonial or imperial connections, whether this was a conscious decision or not, as indeed many were founded on artifacts of the great collectors. Whereas Wales's museums tended to start about 100 years later, over 100 years later, and they were more focused on projecting a Wales that was unique and very different to its larger neighbour next door over the border. And so very much, I think, that idea of belonging and identity is very central to the museums we have around us in Wales. But Wales is changing. And just looking at some Welsh government statistics from 2019, so this is 5 years ago, and I'm sure it will have changed since then, 12% of all learners in schools in Wales are of an ethnic minority background. And of course, this varies from place to place, where we have 34.4% in Cardiff and 4.1% in Anglesey. But I don't think there's hardly a school in Wales that doesn't have either ethnically diverse learners or staff. And so this project is about encouraging a new understanding of the origins of many of our museum objects and about exploring new ways of talking about them with different voices. And so it of course is not about replacing the rich history we already have, but it is about opening up new ways of looking at it. And that sense of belonging and sense of place is critical to everything that we are doing. I just love this photograph. And yes, Wales is changing. It is still predominantly white, of course, but our hospitals, our healthcare services, our universities, and geopolitical crises from over the world now make even the most rural parts of Wales far more diverse than they've ever been before. And people of different ethnicities have been here in Wales for generations. And I love this photo of 3 little Welsh girls here. They're celebrating the Queen's coronation in 1953, and they're just loving celebrating it dressed in their Welsh costumes. Now, the little cheeky face at the top there, that's Roma Taylor, and I don't think she's changed at all. Now, Roma is head of the Lywodraeth Cymru Elders. That is a body that fights for promoting the Lywodraeth Cymru people living in Wales today. And the 2 girls at the bottom are the daughters of Mrs. Betty Campbell. Some of you may be familiar with Mrs. Betty Campbell. She was Wales's first black head teacher, and her statue is outside the Welsh Government offices in Cardiff today. Now, I speak to Roma often, and she tells me of what it's like to always be considered as other. And she's worked as a nurse in Wales all her life. She's been in the military, in the TAs for many years. And she says it's as if society has never really wanted to get the best out of me, and that recognition of me and what I've done has never been commensurate with any of my past achievements. And she said, why am I still called an immigrant? And it's to address issues like this that this project is really come into being. And so when we look at our collections in our museums, why are we doing this now? Why are we talking about diversity in Wales, whatever you want to call it, diversity, democratising, decolonisation, many terms. Who's it for, why now, and whose responsibility? Well, if you think that the vast majority of our museums are dependent on public funding in some fashion, then that public has a responsibility in seeing, museums have a responsibility to be representative of the public who is funding them. But why now? Why now is a very clear answer to address. It is, of course, the Welsh Government's Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, which has funded many projects. It was initially set up post-2020, of course, with the very public death of George Floyd, the pulling down of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol in 2020. It originally started as the Race Equality Action Plan, the REAP, in 2021, but then changed for 2022 to become the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. So when I talk of the RWAP, it's the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. And the plan talks about investing in all our people will help the people of Wales appreciate the extent to which they are part of a wider international community. This is for everyone, irrespective of what your colour is. It's for all the people of Wales. The RWAP aims to create meaningful change to the lives of ethnic minority people and strives to eliminate inequality in all its forms. And how does it do that? Deliverables of the RWAP include that the history and culture of our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities are properly represented by investing further in our cultural sector and museum work. So that is it. It's stated very clearly in the RWAP that this impacts on museums. And in November 2022, Dawn Bowden announced a really significant body of funding, £4.5 million, with £2.8 million going into the cultural sector, with 22 organisations being charged with delivering various projects. And this is where I come in, because I'm one of those 22. So was it just a case of, okay, let's just get on with it? It's easy. No, it is absolutely not. Our museum staff are highly educated people, and our museums are full of, just tremendous people doing fantastic work under very difficult circumstances, not least, of course, because of reduced funding and funding that is being increasingly reduced. And most of the staff in our museums have at least one degree, and many of them have masters and beyond. And typically, when any organisation goes into change management, you get teams of professionals coming in, and change management is managed very carefully with the team. But in the past, whenever any diversifying work has been done, it's been a case of just get on with it. And it's not easy. It is stressful. Now, this isn't the first time museums have been charged to do work like this. Some of you may remember in 2007, the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, where hundreds of events took place at museums across the country. Now, afterwards, all that learning, what happened was basically dropped from every single museum that took part in that, and it proved very challenging for any of the learning that took place in 2007 to become embedded. Now, I'd been working for the National Trust for many years by this point, and realised the problems that many within the heritage sector were facing in what to me was becoming increasingly evident that museums would have to change to diversify their ways of working. And so I left National Trust, went to Bangor University, did a PhD on the heritage industry and the slave trade, so that lessons from 2007 could not be lost, and it could be used to support museums as they build into the future. Now, I was lucky enough before this RWAP funding came into being to receive a pocket of money from the Welsh Government to run a year-long pilot beforehand. And what was striking was that the issues I identified following 2007 were still there in 2021. And so the key findings of the pilot and of my research, identified some things that I really wanted to address when I was putting this current project together. And this was that staff had limited knowledge of how their collections are connected to empire or Atlantic slavery. How can you work with what you've got if you don't know what you've got? There were very few exemplars that they could turn to, very few examples of best practice. That is now, of course, improving. Many thanks to the AWAB, we are seeing very real change at museums in Wales. Limited professional learning and discursive opportunities. Training is absolutely critical, and there's a lot of excellent training programs now coming out of the AWAB to support museum programs. Limited experience in engaging with minority ethnic people, despite the fact that many people, of course, would have mates, chums of all different ethnicities. When you're working at a professional level, it can generate all sorts of different stresses, and you want to get it right. And so building up that confidence was very important. Enthusiasm high, confidence and experience is low. And that's one thing I was very keen that this project would address. Limited ethnic diversity in the workforce. I'll be coming to that later on. And these two, I think, work very well together. A need for far stronger stakeholder engagement and a need for a whole organisation approach. Now, I will come back to that in a moment, but suffice to say at this point that the project I headed was based on very sound academic research and on a very successful pilot. Having been in the position that I was isolated in having to deliver quite stressful projects, I thought it was really important that we support these staff as they move forward in their work. And so the need for a whole organisation approach is critical. Something that York University identified as the curatorial complex, because it is typical, and I personally don't like that term, but I think it's quite useful. Usually work dealing with ethnic minority communities was typically seen as the job of just one person alone. It was a community officer, an engagement officer, an education officer. They were usually front of house. They were sometimes on fixed term contracts, usually very short part-time workers. And so they were expected to just get on with it and without it impacting in any way on the main role of the museum. That is, it never extended beyond front of house. And having been there myself, it is stressful responding to new working conditions. It is really traumatic researching traumatic histories. I've been doing it for 30 years. It still hits you when you have to read these histories. The consultation process, you soon learn that there's no such thing as a single black identity, a single brown identity, a single white identity. And so having to navigate all those conversations can bring its own set of challenges, especially when you're working alone. And also then responding to the responsibilities of representing contested stories without a full organisational support. And especially as we know, things it's very volatile out there at the moment. And this came across, and staff recognised that they weren't being supported as they should be by their organisations when they were expected to deliver this work. And one museum staff member told me, among some museum professionals, carrying out this work has left a perception of a lack of serious commitment to the process from their institution, and institutions won't commit when there's an element of risk. And in terms of a legacy for any of this work, it has not been thought through. So based on all of this, I put together the project that had 4 key deliverables to hopefully be able to challenge those key findings that I identified earlier. The first one was having a robust collections review so that the museum staff would know what they've actually got. And the second was online training to address those training needs, give people a chance to talk, give people a chance to share ideas. Very important, to bring communities and museums together and to provide some form of legacy support. Now, to do this, I put together a small but excellent team to work with me. So managing most of the collections review is Peter Alexander, who I think is with us here today. So hello to Peter. So Peter worked with me for the National Trust for many years. He's an independent heritage consultant and is the former head of heritage services for Denbighshire County Council. And working with me on on-site training is beloved Adonai. Now, she has worked in the heritage sector for over 10 years, and both of us met. We're both members of the Museum Association's Decolonisation Skills Steering Group, and she also works for Artist Monday in Cardiff. And I'd also like to thank Audrey West, who contributed to the early stages of the project. I brought in some external partners, and the partners are the Museum Federation Cymru and also Race Council Cymru to provide us advice and guidance. So who are the museums that we're working with? There are about 100 museums in Wales. Now, what is a museum, of course, can vary considerably, but there's about 100. The scope of the project does not work with all of them. We cannot bring in all of them. We're not working with the 7 nationals, nor with the about 20 National Trust properties, or a handful of sort of specialist university museums. I'll be giving an example of one in a moment. And a couple of other museums. So about 65 that you might call local museums. These are ones that are run by local authorities, town councils, independents, charities, trusts. They're run by a whole range of different people, full-time, part-time, volunteers. Some are open every day, some are only open a couple of days a week. And in the pilot, we worked with 10. We worked with 11 in the first year of the RWAP, 10 in the second year of the RWAP, and we have enough funding and time to work with 8 in this final year of the RWAP. So I think that comes to 39. So of the what you might call 65 that are available, we are working with well over half of those. Now, it'd be wrong to say that no work has been done before, because a lot of excellent engagement work has been happening in our museums for quite some time now in engaging with ethnic minority backgrounds. But it's about knowing, it's about more than that, because they weren't, of course, engaging in their collections and communities in the way that fulfilled the goals of the RWAP, because the RWAP wasn't around then. It's very new. So it is about knowing your collections and being honest about them and embedding long-term change and genuine engagement and co-production with ethnic minority communities. So is it a case that Peter just goes in and, looks through the displays and picks out a couple of objects? Well, no, as I'm sure we all know, that only 10% of what a museum has is typically on show. The rest are in storerooms, in boxes like the ones that you see here. And to manage them so they know they have catalogues. Most of which have been digitized, and I use the word most very hesitantly, because some have not. And so we have to be familiar with CAMS and MODES, the 2 main collections management software programs. And there are some that have still not been digitized. And so Peter has to wade through print catalogues that have been produced over several years in different formats. Some objects are obvious, and the museum staff know full well what these are, and some we need to look at carefully with new eyes. What are they? What are they made of? Where are they from? What's their date? Who gave them to the museum? Where did they get their money from? We need to know the colonial names for things so we know what to search for. Burma, not Myanmar. Bombay, not Mumbai. We need to know the dates of various military conflicts so we can see if there's any military memorabilia that people have collected, for example, Welsh Fusiliers, because they took part in actions all over the world over several hundred years. And we all know, of course, about the exotica, ivory fans, silk robes. But what about the perhaps less obvious connections? Well, just looking at something as sort of commonplace as a gas mask, a World War II gas mask. Now, several of the museums we work with run museum education programs, and we know, of course, increasingly about the support for Britain from across its then colonies. Britain could not have survived without the support of its former colonies. But we like to look further than this. What's it made out of? Where's its seals come from? What are they made of? The seals are made out of rubber from Africa, South America. And what about the webbing strap that keeps it on your face? Cotton from India, from Egypt, from the US. And what about the filtration system? Typically, in many of them, this was asbestos that in many instances came from Australia and Canada on Aboriginal or First Nations land. And where were most gas masks made for the Second World War? Most of them were made in Australia. And we know that museum programs have already changed their education programs with the information that we've been able to cover with them as a consequence of our reviews. And of course, there's lots and lots of glitzy stuff. This amazing ceremonial horn here was presented to David Lloyd George by his constituents. He was, of course, MP for Carnarvon Boroughs, and of course went on to become Prime Minister. There's so many Welsh stories to be told here, not only about Lloyd George, and of course from then on moving out to Wales and the world, Britain and the world. But just look at the object itself. You've got the Welsh dragon here, you've got the Welsh harp here. So many lovely Welsh stories that we can talk about with this item. But the gold, where did the gold come from? It's South African gold. And what about the base? Mahogany, a tropical wood grown in several British colonies. And so it's about how we use our objects to extrapolate so many more stories than we've been telling in the past. And not so much an object of the elite, but one about the ordinary person. Pipes, our museums are full of not only ordinary, simple clay pipes like this, but quite elaborate and fancy ones as well. Not only this, but the paraphernalia of tobacco tins, tobacconist shop signs. Now, we all know, of course, that tobacco was produced by enslaved labor in the US until the Civil War. But what most people forget about is Empire tobacco. Empire tobacco was blended from tobacco grown in several former British colonies, several of the African countries, and also in Canada. Who knew that Canada was growing tobacco? And Empire blend tobacco was sold in Britain until at least 1947, after the Second World War. And so again, so many more stories are opening up new vistas of reinterpretation with these museum objects. And how humble is a little packet of tea? Now, of course, nostalgia is absolutely critical. I remember my grandmother opening a packet of tea, the smell, the ritual. And so nostalgia is really important. And I do work with museums when we explore, the nostalgia, the homeland of rural Wales, or the townscapes of Wales when they were opening their packets of tea. But an object like this, so simply presented, Frank Little of Colwyn Bay, I think this reflects very clearly that consumer consumption in all parts of Wales was closely tied to imperial products and global trading. But also we can look to the origins of tea, China, India, and of course the various journeys that tea made around the world to come to us. Now, this one may be a humble and discreet little package, but others, I assure you, were not. And here's one several of our museums actually have, packets or tins like this one is of Masawattī tea. Now, despite its somewhat exotic name, Masawattī tea was produced by a company based in Devon. They were originally tea importers as middlemen, so that shopkeepers like Frank Little in Colwyn Bay could buy his tea to repackage it there. But they decided to market their own tea directly, and they came up with the name of Masawattī because they wanted it to sound exotic and linked, as you can see from that image, directly to the empire. Maza is apparently aligned to a Hindi word that means pleasure, and wati is linked to a Sinhalese word for garden. So pleasure garden tea is what this is supposed to be based on. But just think of the conversations that you could have around these images here. It's such a strong image, and as I say, Maserati tea, there are several Maserati tea packets in our museums in Wales. And what about our industry? Now, this is a company token. Now, it was customary, of course, for industrial employers to pay their workers with their own coins that could only be spent in their own shops, of course. And there's so many conversations that we could have about the growth of industrial towns in Wales, the growth of union movement, protecting workers' rights, all the things that happens around growing industrialization in Wales. But they can sell so many other stories as well. This coin, it says around the outside, John Wilkinson, Ironmaster. Now, John Wilkinson was Ironmaster of Bersham Ironworks in Wrexham. Now, he was a great pioneer of cast iron manufacturing at the end of the 18th century. And he and his partner, Anthony Bacon, down in Cyfoeth, down in South Wales, he supplied, well, they basically had the monopoly for providing cannon and other armaments to the East India Company, Atlantic trading ships, Atlantic slaving ships, and the Royal Navy, which plied the oceans, of course, keeping the channel safe for all those other voyages to keep going. But we also know from the records of Wrexham, and they show very clearly that Bersham Ironworks were also manufacturing cane crushers, which were to be shipped out to sugar plantations in the Caribbean, worked by enslaved labour. And this is an interesting item. I don't know if any of you know what it is. It's certainly at first glance, many people tell me it looks like a piece of fabric. It's actually not. It's a piece of copper sheathing, and it's to go on the hulls of slaving ships, as you can see here. Copper, Welsh copper, was much used in the Atlantic world, the imperial world, much used by the East India Company, the Royal Navy, Atlantic slavery. It was absolutely key. We can see it used here to protect ships from the teredo worm that burrowed into the wood, into the timbers of the ship. It made them far faster, made them more maneuverable, and also to make millions of these. These are called manillas. They're various different sizes. They're basically currency. As we would use coins now, and these were used specifically. Millions of these were made in Wales specifically for the Atlantic market. They had no other purpose than to go to West Africa to be either exchanged directly for enslaved people or for victuals, to supply the ships for the Atlantic journey over to the Americas. Sugar was boiled down, sugar juice was boiled down in these large vats, huge vats, hundreds, sometimes thousands of gallons big, and the implements used to skim off the foam at the top before they crystallized and exchange ingots like these here. Welsh copper is an essential part of the Atlantic and imperial story, and our museums hold several examples of Welsh copper in them. Now, I don't have much time to cover the story, of course, but we have Paris Mountain on Anglesey, where most of the copper was mined, and these were Paris Mountain was at that time owned by, half of it still is, by the Pagets of Plas Newydd, and also the other half by the Hughes family, who went on, they made so much money from their ownership of the other half of Paris Mountain that they went on to become ennobled as Lords Dinorban of Kinmel Hall. And the copper was smelted at Holywell here, when several of those sheathing panels were made, and down in Swansea here, where they even had one of the copper works there had a Manila house that did nothing but churn out millions of those manillas for the Atlantic slave trade. And so there are lots and lots of stories that can be told in our museums about this story. And our museums do have, it's surprising how many museums do have manillas in them. Objects like this can tell so many stories. And just think now, if you wanted to interpret that, to me, it's important. It's not about replacing one dominant narrative with another dominant narrative. It's about bringing in different voices so that we get a broader understanding of the object. So who should tell the story of Manila? We could bring in, for example, people from Amlwch, other people, descendants of copper workers, people who worked in the smelting works, descendants of those who've live in Holywell, in Swansea, people involved, perhaps whose descendants, whose ancestors rather, worked in the shipping, mercantile, people from West Africa, people in the Americas. So many ways that you can explore these stories. But if you don't know that past, mistakes can happen. And Peter spotted this on his journey around the museums. And this might have been called in the old days an ethnographic display and of African artifacts. And you see here manillas here. And let's remember that these were specifically made to be exchanged for human lives, for human beings. They were labeled as African jewelry. Now, Peter let the curator know immediately, and the curator immediately removed them and is now going through a process of re-examining these objects. And so, yeah, it is about understanding what you have and what it means and how you can rework them so they speak for everyone. And what about recognizing the diverse presence? Our museums hold thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of photographs. And this is a lovely photograph here. This is of the Queen's Jubilee in 1977. It's a school, and you've got the King and Queen of Hearts here with their tarts. You've got the Knave of Hearts here, and you've got the two courtiers behind, one a little black boy, one a little white boy, and they are all joining in together in the celebrations. And photographs like this, where you've got Pentecostal gospel meeting that is celebrating the Black presence in Wales. But not all the artifacts we have in our museums tell such a positive story, and we do have evidence in our museums of things such as the race riots that took place in several places in 1919. Now, this is a receipt, and it's a receipt for damage caused by the riots, where money was paid out to Mohammed Abdullah here. And so again, there are other stories that can be told from what we have in our museums. And so just through a few objects, I just wanted to show you the sorts of things that we're identifying, along with some of the stories that we can say about them. And so having done the collections review, we then do the training. And we encourage the museums to invite as many people as possible. There are many staff, many volunteers. Some museums are tiny, where they just have one member of paid staff, sometimes more, sometimes just volunteers. I always start with going over what the RWAP is and sharing some of those stories, because when you engage emotionally with the reason why you're doing something, that's half the journey. We discuss some of their objects with them from the review that Peter would have done. And we then just talk. We share examples of best practice, what's happening elsewhere in the country, what's happening around the world. We listen to what they have to say. We talk them through some of the lack of confidence they may have, some of their concerns that they may have, and just build ourselves into a position that we can talk openly about what can be done before we then take the next step. And so by spending time with them, we really do get to know what their concerns are and hopefully work through these with them. Now, what have some of the museum staff thought of this? Well, this is what they've told us what they think about it. I thought we knew our collections well, but this training shone a light on the realization that we don't know a lot about these objects and their place within different cultures and their histories. You've been fantastic at listening to our ideas and providing reassurance. It's given us confidence to progress with the project about reinterpreting objects with local ethnic minority communities. It brought staff and volunteers together to explore our collections in a way we've never done before. We were able to ask questions and discuss ideas comfortably, giving us confidence as we move forward, and it highlighted objects and stories we may not have considered before. We opened up. It gave us a good chance to ask questions in a safe environment. It was good to talk to all our staff about these issues without feeling self-conscious. I would highly recommend this project. We found it transformational and educational. So all great, but how did we transform and how did we educate? And so I just want to go through some of the follow-up projects, that engagement now with ethnic minority communities. Now, and I'm going to include some of the projects that some of the museums we worked with during our pilot phase as well, because of course it takes time to embed these. And so some of these are only now coming to fruition. So this is the Egypt Centre down in Swansea. Now, for the pilot in the first year of the RWAP, I didn't have any funding to support the museums to do follow-up work. And so I worked with them to get funding from other quarters. But for the second and third year, I do have capital spend to give to the museums, which I'll come to in a minute. So for this project with the Egypt Centre, I sought funding from the Welsh Government and from the Art Fund and from Museum Development UK. And this was working, 4 museums took part, all different parts of Wales, each had a different theme, working with a different group, with a different ethnicity and different ages. But I just want to go over this one with you now. Now, of course, museums are brilliant at working with youth groups, with kids. They do it really well. They do holiday programs. And so what is so different about this one then? Well, for one thing, it happened over several weeks. What was important to me was it wasn't just using the museum as a venue. The group had to be shown, and this was with all four of the groups. They had to see behind the scenes of the museum, see those boxes we were talking about earlier, meet the different staff, find out the different roles that were in a museum, and also for the groups then to tell the museum staff about themselves. And obviously it was funded by Art Fund, Museum Development. There was some element of creativity. So each group, after working with the museum, sharing information over a few weeks, had to then produce some kind of creative response to what they were seeing. One group did it through art, one through creative writing, one through craft element. They were an older group, and the youth group wanted to do it through dance and music. And so they produced a piece based on their feelings of working in the Egypt Centre, and they performed it in the heart of the museum. We wanted to see more than anything what difference it would make to the museum and what difference it would make to the group. Well, what did the group learn? This is what the youth leader told me, that they had learned, that the museum is accessible and welcoming for all peoples from diverse ethnic backgrounds. I believe the children went away with life skills about how to interpret collections and to see a future in considering working in the museum. And this is critical. We heard earlier on about lack of diversity in the workforce. There is, of course, increase in ethnic diversity within the workforce at the moment. But this again can be quite problematic because most of it tends to be project-based. A lot of people have been employed with RWAP funding. What happens at the end of that funding? They tend to be diversity officers, engagement officers, all doing amazing work. But what happens at the end of their project? Why can't somebody of an ethnic minority background be a curator in 17th century Dutch art if they want to? And we need to give them experiences like this so they can see behind the scenes, so they can get to understand that perhaps there is a career for me within the heritage sector. And so it is about opening doors to young people. And so a part of the project has been to encouraging museums to work with their schools to develop, for example, youth panels, young ambassador programs, to build this knowledge and experience so they will consider the heritage sector as viable career options for themselves. And shooting up to North Wales now, this is the reimagining of the African Institute of Colwyn Bay. And the exhibition that they've produced on this is still on in Colwyn Bay now. It is on until the end of the year, I think. And Rachel, standing next to me in the blue dress there, she was part of the first year of the RWAP project. And after we'd done the training, she spoke to me immediately about her desire to explore this subject. Now, it'd be lovely. I'd love to tell you more about the history of the African Institute, but sadly, we don't have time. I can only signpost you. Look online, there's a lot of material on there now. So she applied to AIM for funding, which is Association of Independent Museums. They also have RWAP funding. So you can see, and also GEM for Group for Education in Museums. They also have been working with them as well on delivering their program. So you can see how all these programs are actually working together to support, to deliver the RWAP in various forms. Now, she met Chief Thomas here from Democratic Republic of Congo, and I put her in touch with Jean-Samuel here, who is an artist from Cameroon. And together they worked with schools, local history groups, general public, and a local creative media company, TAPE. And that material is available online for you to see. Now, I'm aware, of course, that the two projects I've shown you so far are with people of African heritage, but that's only because those are the ones I've got the picture of. The program has included people of many different ethnicities from countries such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Iran, Jordan, Poland, Romania, several African countries, and also people from different Caribbean countries as well. One of those projects, and this is with the body of capital spend that I have within my grant now to support permanent change at sites, is this is one of them here, where a museum worked with its local communities. Rather than work with one, they wanted to identify which were the predominant ethnic minority communities in their areas, and people wanted the museum guide to be translated into their languages. So instead of the usual, when you walked in the door, you would have Welsh and English guides. You now have 5 guides to choose from, not only Welsh and English, but Polish, Arabic, and Bengali. It's a lovely way to make sure that the minute you walk through the door, there's something there for you, something visible that shows that that site takes you seriously. One of the other projects we've worked with, where there's massive institutional change going on, but they still wanted to get involved in this project. They, with their pocket of money, they had high quality 3D scans made of some of their colonial objects. This is great for research and educational use across the board. And working with these, they then had 3D printed objects of a Georgian tea set that had been donated to the museum by someone who'd made a lot of money from imperial initiatives. And so they're now working on a first stage of a very long-term project to explore the journey of sugar and tea into the UK. They've just appointed a museum community officer, and I've put them in touch with an Indian group, and so they're discussing a first stage of that project, which they hope to develop, working with many different groups over the coming years. And so with the year 2 funding and year 3 funding, it's only a small amount of funding I have to give them, but a local museum can do a lot with a little. And things that they've done, some of the museums have done, have been an inclusive welcome panel. So many times people ask about some of the why don't people, our doors are open to everybody. Why don't people just come in? Well, if you haven't been to a museum before, you feel it's not for you, it's very challenging. You don't know. And so it can be very difficult moving into a space you may not feel comfortable in. And so having just something as simple as a diverse welcome panel can make all the difference to whether somebody will actually cross your threshold or not. But there's other things as well, like, for example, discovery boxes, which can be used on site and off site. So going out into communities instead of just waiting for people to go to them, and a whole range of stuff regarding interpretation panels, changes in labeling, and changes in the way that you catalogue your objects. Now, by the time an object ends up in a museum, there are many stories it can tell, as we've seen from that manila I showed you earlier. Now, ivory is a good one, and because especially there are loads and loads of ivory items, whether it's inlay, decorative jewelry in our museums. We really have in our local museums the history of the world in their contents. And ivory's a good one because you can use it to tell, because museums are now looking at new ways of how they address their collections, not only from a historical perspective, but also from contemporary contexts. For example, the global decline of our large animals, poaching, unethical use of natural products. Now, I sent this photograph to one of my friends. You've just seen his photograph, enfawr Samuel. And I asked him, he's from Cameroon, and I asked him just to write about a couple of sentences on what an ivory fan meant to him. Because I remember the stories he's told me over the years of growing up in a small village in Cameroon, and the engagement they had with the indigenous wildlife there. And I asked him to write it not only in English, but also in his own indigenous original language of Lamanceau. And this is what he wrote. And I translated it, so it's here in Welsh, Lamanceau, and English. Hi, my name's enfawr Samuel. This fan made out of ivory has special meaning to me. Some aspects of my childhood experience have never had any closure. As a child, I remember encountering elephants that occasionally came very close to our village farms during the harvesting season, so as to get nourishment from maize and some other plants. At the moment, due to a decline in elephant population due to illegal poaching and destruction of their habitats, many Cameroonians are fighting hard to save or conserve these African elephants. Now, you'll notice that there's nothing here about the fan itself. It's about his experiences and about his views on how that fan affected him. And so there's so much space here to bring in those other voices, the curatorial voice, other community voices. Now, I bet now, if ever you go to a museum and you see a fan, you'll never again look at a fan without thinking of what Sam has told us. And I think this really does show the value of bringing in these extra voices. And what about those behind the scenes changes that I was so keen on at the very beginning, that whole site approach? As I say, this is not a race, it's a process, and it's taking time. But there are some excellent examples of institutional change going out there. And a lot of museums have now started doing focus groups to find out what their communities actually want, all different ethnicities. They're engaging with their local communities, all different backgrounds, to improve their search terms for their catalogues, so that not only have you got the more traditional, again, it's about not replacing the existing terms, but adding to them with perhaps authentic terms. For example, it's not just a piece of African cloth or a piece of Nigerian cloth, it's Kenti cloth, because somebody from the group recognized the origins of that cloth, and they can add proper descriptors to how it was used. They can offer advice on the care of that fabric regarding the dyes it has in it, and also collecting views and opinions of what's important to them, which is impacting, it is leading to some museums actually updating their acquisitions policy to include new members of their communities. And so what have the museums told us about what they thought of their engagement work with these different communities? How diverse people were keen to explore Welsh heritage. I think sometimes we can be blind to the quality of the things that we have in our museums, because it's the ethnic minority groups we've spoken to not only want to see themselves represented, but they also want to know what's in a Welsh museum. Why is it there? One group I spoke to said, I see a wooden chair in a museum. It was about historic Welsh furniture. And they said, I have a chair in my home. What makes that chair different? Why is that chair in that museum? They genuinely want to know. It is very much, and I think this is so important, it's not a one-way sharing of information, it's a two-way sharing of information where everybody benefits. How museum objects can easily generate very natural conversations around different and shared experiences and backgrounds. It was wonderful to hear the participants' interpretation of the object. It gave us a lot to think about. Breaking down those barriers of confidence and communication is so important. That we as a museum and gallery can do a lot more in terms of developing our community offer. Working with this community group was very rewarding and proved insightful in terms of our aims with diversity and inclusion. That more community members would engage with their local museums when they're invited to. Just speak to them, just speak to them. We want the legacy of this project to be that we actively embed community-led voices into the stories we tell about colonial objects. We want this to be second nature to our work. And what about the communities themselves? What did the people who engage with museums think of it? And this is in, of course, their own voices. I felt proud to have contributed to this project and also to listen to other views. I felt this was a place that wanted to learn about my lived experiences. I have more urge to visit a museum, to learn more about history all around the world. Gives me an insight on how museums operate and display, and gives me inspiration to approach the museum and share my views and thoughts. Makes me want to ask questions and understand context rather than first impressions. Oh, please, can we all remember that one? That I'm seen, that people are making me and my culture more inclusive. Now, it's been great to share these examples with you. And to me, I feel that we've been able to provide museums with at least some of the knowledge, the confidence, and the connections at whatever stage they're at. Some are at the very beginning of their journey, and some are quite advanced. But it's been such a pleasure to be able to work with these groups and these museums. But one thing that's clear, one size does not fit all. I mentioned earlier some of the different ethnicities we're working with, and that is because they have wanted to join this. You will not have heard me mention other groups such as Gypsy, Roma, Traveller, and this is because we now know that we need other tools and approaches to reach out to some groups that is outside of the scope of what we can do with this particular project. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we will have worked with over half the local museums in Wales, and so on the whole, it's been a large project, but on the ground, it is small. We only get a couple of days for the collections review, only one day to do the training, a couple of days for the legacy support. And so nothing that you have seen today would have happened without the buy-in of the museums. And more than anything, of course, the trust of the community groups in this process. A couple of months ago, a young man, he expressed deep suspicion in the project he'd been invited to participate in. But we've now got a growing body of work that we can show him how his contributions would be used. We can now show him that it's not tokenism and that there's hopefully something long-lasting that will come out of this. And because we now have examples that we could show him, he not only agreed to join the project, but he became one of the most active members of the group. Now, it is a slow process for some museums due to funding, due to reduced staffing levels, and so don't expect to see instant change when you walk into a museum. But change is happening. There's a lot of change going on out there. It is, I say, it's a process. It's not a race, but there's some phenomenal things going out there. And so before going into Q&As and discussion, what I'd like to do is to just share a quote here from Rachel Evans of Conwy Culture. And she said, from the RWAP training, we learned the importance of co-production, how interpretation should be the result of this co-production, with engagement events designed to bring up many voices. The opportunity to work with an African artist in North Wales is a rare opportunity, which elevated the project, as the participants had access to first-hand knowledge and skills of a successful African painter. Being introduced to enfawr has been one of the best things to happen to the Cymru Museum and Archive Services. And at that point, I'd like to stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Marian. My goodness, in a short time, you've taken us through such a lot of history, but also the process that you've embarked on of change. And it's so wonderful to hear the very positive feedback of the work that you've been undertaking. I just wondered, I mean, I love the picture of Roma, because I haven't seen her as a little child. So that was wonderful. And I'll give you another take on the maza tea. So maza, of course, means enjoyable, pleasurable. Va is another term which is like beyond pleasure. So maza va tea, and people used to say tea on the Indian subcontinent. So that's another interpretation.
That's joy. Thank you, Paminda. Thank you.
Do you think Peter would like to come in and say a few words?
Peter, if you'd like to, please do.
Just indicate, and we can enable you to put the camera on. Okay, well, maybe later. David, over to you. I think we've got something in
Hello?
We have.
Yeah, hello.
Hi there. We have actually got Peter back. So, Peter, do you want to say something now before we go into the Q&As?
Just a couple of things. Firstly, pardon for the voice. On last Friday, I went down with COVID, so I'm my voice isn't my best at the moment. I wasn't head of service with Denbighshire. I was the curatorial manager. Susan Dallow was head of service at the time.
Thank you, Peter.
But yes, I think one of the most important things in the whole project has been the cooperation of the staff at each of the museums in giving us access to the collections.
I agree. Whereas previously there's been resistance, and we know from what happened in 2007 that there was resistance, but now they could not be more helpful. They genuinely want to know. So yeah, poor Peter, he has got COVID and he's not feeling very well at all. Thank you so much for attending today, Peter.
That's perfectly all right, but believe me, there's good reasons I haven't put my camera on. You don't want to see this.
Thank you for sharing. Sorry to put you on the spot. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to come in. Thank you. Speedy recovery.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. So I'll go on to ask some questions, and actually I would like to ask a question of my own, actually, from my own perspective, a little bit selfishly to start with. I'm involved with one of the museums you mentioned, which is entirely sort of volunteer run, and I was just wondering what advice you had for those kind of museums, and how and also a wider question about how the other half of museums who didn't take part in the project can start looking at their own collections and so on. Is there a sort of toolkit available, anything like that?
I think those are really good questions. What we're trying to do is something that each museum is different, each object is different, but within that there are certain commonalities of approaches. I think what's absolutely clear is that you've got to know what you've got, and you've got to, so how you can do that, and that is something certainly at the beginning of every report. Peter provides a little methodology. We are producing a that goes by the name of e-zine. It is an online I suppose, yeah, zine, magazine, that will cover examples, it'll cover the methodology, and this will be available at the end of the project. So that's December of this year. And within that, we'll have approaches, examples, case studies. Now, the reason why we haven't been able to reach the ones we didn't do is that we did not have the time and we didn't have the money. So it is very limited to the number that we can do. And so we worked with the Museum Federation to invite museums. We wanted to get as broad a spread as possible. You know, if we would have loved to have included everybody, and if further funding comes up, it would be great to continue the work. And indeed, some museums, because they got so much out of the some local authorities, because they got so much out of the collection museum, we could only do one in their area, actually themselves funded further collections reviews in their area. And so that's certainly by the time we get to the end of the year, not so much a toolkit, but yeah, in many ways it'll show methodology, approach, examples of how we did it. And as you can see as well, it's just go out and speak to people.
Great, thanks very much. That's really interesting. And actually talking about e-zines and articles and so on brings on to the first of the questions in the Q&A. And it says, is there an opportunity for relevant small museum articles to be brought out in various relevant community events locally?
Now, do you mean to take the objects out of the museum into the community space?
I think so, yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's a real, because I'm very keen on actually breaking down the walls of what you might consider to be a traditional museum, and there are really many ways. It can be challenging taking an original artifact, especially if it's the only one you've got. Now, we saw what one museum did in having 3D printed copies made, which can work really, really well. What I've seen work elsewhere, because I have no life whatsoever except this, and I spend a lot of my time looking at what museums around the world do. And there's some great work going on in museums in America. Now, a lot of museums in America have a lot of money. They have massive endowments. You get massive tax relief off it. You know, donating and supporting museums. And so what they have done is that they've gone out into communities and they've projected an image of the object on a local wall and just talk to people on the side of the road. I think that's a fab idea. And so there's so many. If you have sometimes there's multiple copies of something you might have in a museum. Museums are now having to consolidate, thinking carefully what they need to keep. But sometimes if it's only one, it is challenging being able to take that object out. But there are so many different, really innovative ways that you can work around this.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Michael. It's quite long, so I'll try and summarize it. But first of all, he says it's a different slant on your hugely informative lecture. And he's talking about collaborative relationships and sharing collections. But I think he's mainly asking about related parks and gardens as sort of creative works of art, and getting those kind of gardens to be able to sort of qualify for inclusions. And he mentions the York and Horniman museums are examples where this is done successfully, and the Carmarthenshire Museum set in Bishop's Park. So do you think there are others in Wales that could contribute to this potential diversification of community engagement?
I absolutely love gardens, and I think that's a great way of engaging with communities. And I know that some museums, when they have the spaces, are actually developing things such as community gardens. But there are some museums as well that are doing this in really creative ways. It doesn't have to be a garden. It could be a flower bed or just a box. There's one museum, it's not in Wales, it's in England. They actually, in their foyer, put up a little greenhouse in their garden, and they tried as much as possible to, based on the communities they had and their collections, to have plants that represented those communities growing in that greenhouse, and having people from those communities coming in and tending them. And that actually works to help combat that how do you get across the threshold bit, because if you can get them across the door into the foyer, and then that opens up, then come and have a look to see what else we've got. So yeah, I think parks and gardens are a fantastic way of working together with heritage and communities.
Okay, great, thanks very much. The next question is how would you approach reviewing military objects in military collections?
That's really interesting, because obviously we have a lot of military memorabilia. Now it is always challenging, because we cannot deny that the vast majority of our especially historic military organisations, and if you have a look at, for example, the Welsh Fusiliers, just 30 seconds on Wikipedia will give you a long list of the various conflicts and actions that the Welsh Fusiliers have been party to. But it is important we also bring in those multiple voices, and this is where polyphony, multiple voices, however you like to word it, become really essential, because as we know, in many instances, the tragedy of young men going off to war, perhaps getting killed, the letters that they wrote home, it is about making sure that no single narrative takes over any other. It's exploring the Welsh identity as well as the stories of those in those different countries. And so there are I'm working now with a museum with some of its medals with the members of the British Armed Forces. We have a lot of veterans, and so especially with the Welsh Government policies with health and well-being, and so there are many stories that you can work with military memorabilia to bring a wider engagement, and that's something that I love about the multiple voices that you can bring into this interpretation.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Gareth, who asks, also first of all says, thank you, Marian. I'd like to ask if there are any links between the National Trust collections and the museums, especially in the context of how the artefacts came into their collections.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I said at the beginning, I worked for the National Trust for nearly 20 years, and there are several reasons why we didn't include the National Trust. But one thing, it's a larger organisation, and also I think for this, the National Trust has already done quite a lot of work on its collections anyway, and we really wanted to make sure that the money was spent on the museums that were actually at the heart of organisations that people could just walk in for, typically for free. And so we wanted to make sure the public money was spent on things that the public could access on a regular basis. Now, regarding the National Trust, the National Trust has gone through many phases. It's faced, as you know, it's facing a lot of opposition from certain quarters. I was one of the contributing historians to the report that was published a few years ago that generated a lot of kickback from various media. But it is, and also when you think of its stately homes, so many of its collections are directly connected to imperialism in some form. So it's not quite, but almost. If you're looking at its catalogue, it's sort of all on this page, sort of thing. And so that's a different organisation to the ones we wanted to work with, and they are themselves working through very complex ways of sharing those stories.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Nina, who says, I'm interested in ensuring that the correct terminology is used in collections and historic environment data sets. Is there an active co-produced process to define the terminology we should use? And then she goes on to say, to date, there has rightly been on the focus that we should not use, but it would be good to define what terms should replace which terms should replace them.
Oh, I love this one. This is such an interesting one. And of course, this comes up time and time again. Now, some people like to be definitive. Some people do not. Language changes all the time. Had we come up with a glossary a few years ago, it would be out of date within, almost immediately. Words and meanings change all the time. And we have had some problems with this. Some people have tried an open source glossary, but that, especially with current geopolitical crises can mean it becomes, it makes wiki walls and Wikipedia look like a playground, little tiffs. So it can be very difficult trying to define a set glossary. I would like to point you to the Glamorgan Archives recent guide for researching ethnic minority histories within its collections. It has a very good glossary there. That's available free online. So Glamorgan Archives guidance for interpreting inclusive histories.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. Our last question actually is more of a comment actually, and I think it relates, and it's by the same person who asked the first of the questions, and they comment that the idea of 3D printed display sounds great. This particular action may get more of minority communities locally more interested in their local museum collection. So I think there's very much a thank you there for sharing about that particular approach. Oh no, we've got one more question as well. Again, a return question from Michael. Return to my earlier comment, most parks and gardens are almost invariably comprised of plantings of colonial / foreign origin. So yeah,
absolutely, and especially you've only got to look at the gardens of the National Trust, but there are different things that you can do. So many plants have different meanings now, and certainly with, for example, we now have the Jonastimllin rose that has been named after the black gardener of a Stimllin estate of the Wyn family by Pwllheli, 18th century black gardener there. And I believe they used to, whether they're still doing it or not, I'm tragically forgotten the name of the company, but if you just Google Jonastimllin rose, then there are they give to community initiatives. They were giving a free number of rose bushes of the Jonastimllin rose to a number of different community initiatives every year. But I think, yeah, you can certainly retell the history of empire through our gardens.
Great, thank you very much. That's it for the questions. I think I'll hand back to Paminda now for a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Marian. Thank you to all the contributors. It's been a wonderful, lively, engaging session once again for me, and I'm sure for everybody who's attended. Just to say that this is the last seminar in our current series. So we're really going out on a very big high. Thank you very much again, Marian. And it's over to you, David, to say a few words now.
Okay. Well, i gloi. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am ymuno a'n ni heno, i staff y Comisiwn am Drefnu, ac yn olaf, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, Marian, am eich sgwrs ddiddorol iawn. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thanks to all the Commission staff who have been involved with the arrangements and have made this possible, and of course to you, Marian, for your fascinating talk. Nos da.
Thank you.